Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming. My name is Mariam Salimi, and I'm an architectural assistant at Article 25. These Make Design Matter talks have been organised by Article 25 in partnership with BRE Trust. For those of you that don't know about Article 25, we are a humanitarian architecture charity who specialise in health and education. We use design to improve health, livelihood and resilience to disasters. We are driven by Article number 25 of Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which states that everyone has a right to adequate and dignified shelter, education and healthcare. Our vision is of a world where all communities have access to better housing, safe schools and hospitals, and we provide the skills and knowledge to make this a reality. Make Design Matter are a series of monthly talks where we provide a platform for designers and NGOs who carry out similar work to us to share and discuss ideas and their experiences. Tonight's talk will be about a beautiful school in Cambodia, which was designed by Weston Williamson alongside Engenuiti, Integration and Building Trust. The talk will last approximately 25 to 30 minutes, followed by a Q&A session with the panel, chaired by our trustee Sunand Prashad. We would like to thank Weston Williamson for hosting us this evening. And without further ado, please welcome Phil and Eugene from Weston Williamson and John from Engenuiti. Thank you.
So this was a fantastic project to work on, and like any project at the beginning, you think this the usual things we need to go through. We've got a program to work to. We've got to make some difficult decisions. We have to work very closely with our stakeholders. But then, of course, the project is also very different here because we're working in a very different economy, a different climate, with different materials of limited availability, etc. So on the one side, the project is very similar to what we do perhaps on a day-to-day basis in London and perhaps around the world, but equally it is quite different. So fundamental to this, the beginning of our process, Mardi, who's now with Article 25, just can everybody hear, because I'm not using the microphone. Is that okay? At the back? Yeah, great stuff, thanks. Mardi, who's with Article 25 now, was working at Weston Williamson at the time. And Mardi had formed a relationship with the charity Building Trust, who are based out in Cambodia but work across Southeast Asia as a non-profit charity in the built environment sector, predominantly working in schools and housing, but do a lot of work also with bamboo. So Mardi, we'd been seeking a project to work on and had looked at various opportunities, but then over a period of time, this project sort of came together as what we felt was a right opportunity for us, and then pulled together the team of Engenuiti, structural engineers, integration for M&E assistants, all based in London to work directly with ourselves. So Building Trust, that's just a little bit about them and the type of work they do, but they are absolutely fundamental to the success of this project, with that broader team being the integration on the ground with then the client and the school that we chose to then work with. Most of you will know your world map, but there's a few there locations all around the world that Weston Williamson actually have worked in and are still working in, but highlighting then where this project is down in Southeast Asia. So the capital, Phnom Penh, and then the project was located just to the northeast, about 40 to 50 kilometres away from the capital itself. And the route to get out to the site was halfway along, as you can see there, along essentially the Mekong River, and that's at the point where we then crossed the river that the tarmac roads ran out, and then the village of Khyaung that we worked in is I thought was pretty rural. The roads from that point in turn into dirt tracks, and progressively as we progressed actually into the village itself, the journey became quite a lot more arduous as we got there. So the village itself is relatively small, and the site is an existing school which had two buildings, which was a large block here and a smaller one here, very much built around a a courtyard sort of space, and it was built on the edge of the village itself, looking out over vast expanses of rice paddy fields, with then the core centre of the village to the other side. And central to the site was a series of really prominent trees, which are quite lovely, that you'll see in some forthcoming photos. The climate in Cambodia is tropical, so it has its monsoon season June through to October, and obviously the very, very heavy rains that brings, which generally is flooding quite a lot of the school compound itself, and obviously the paddy fields themselves. The architecture of the village was fascinating. There was a typology of houses that you can see here in the images. Generally, the living quarters were built up on the first floor, primarily to keep away from those rains, and then essentially become the yards underneath. There was generally always a Honda 50cc motorbike under there. There were always 3 or 4 very, very angry dogs if you went very close. For some reason, not many cats at all. Hammocks where during the day they generally, the villagers would sleep to avoid the temperature. But then some really, really elegant detailing in the timber work. Generally the roofs traditionally were either tiled, and a bit of a shame, but you can understand why. The more modern materials that are creeping in with coloured sheeting for the roofs, etc., are changing that sort of vernacular a little bit. That was quite noticeable, but really beautiful. And the primary colours that they were using then to highlight shutters on their windows or the individual panels for the cladding themselves, that was either generally sort of timber. So the diagram at the top shows the school compound itself. Building Trust did a lot of the early reconnaissance for us in terms of talking to the school itself. And the school was part of a group of villages of schools in the neighbourhood that all sort of connect. The Khyaung school was unique in the sense that it was primary and secondary, whereas the other 5 schools in the region were only just the primary. So they had a lot of pressure. The population is growing quite immensely in Cambodia as a result of the atrocities back in the early 70s. So there's a real spike going on. So they are really lacking in school places, and a lot of the population don't have access to school. So part of the reasoning for this project was to increase that capacity. And because they're overstretched, they run a morning school from 7 till I think 11 or 12, and then all of those children go home, and then the next wave come in for the afternoon. So they have to split the school day to cope with the capacity that they're dealing with. So our work obviously helped to alleviate that. One of the older buildings on the site is quite dilapidated, so these images really show what they're dealing with. So particularly during the monsoon time, the rain is pouring through. They have to carry out a lot of their classes out under the verandas, actually outside. So that really is demonstrating the need for the new school that was needed. And some further shots here. They're very proud of their flagpole. They would meet every morning at 7 o'clock, the start of the school day, and line up there. This is one of the more modern buildings on the other side of the quadrangle, again utilising very much the veranda space as a place to protect and play and work. And again, you get a sense here of the views beyond the landscape of the village to these amazing paddy fields that just go on for miles and miles, and the colours that come through from that. So the brief we were given was to provide them with 3 classrooms, around about 40 students each, and in terms of area about 60 metres squared each, was slightly larger than the existing classrooms they had. They were also keen to have a designated library space that they were sort of squeezing in the corners of the current school buildings. And again, I've talked about the daily shifts there that they still need to run to accommodate those students coming in. And we work with Building Trust again to establish, there's nothing too unique here, but really important to understand those key design principles at the beginning about what was available in terms of materiality, the labour, how we can deliver that the environmental principles to understand the climate and learn from their existing buildings where they're failing, particularly listening to them as the stakeholders, the teachers, and what the wider villages also need, and making sure that what we design is durable and long-lasting. Key to that brief making at the beginning was this slide that they gave us, which was, you know, a broad brush of the available materials that we really need to work with. And I think most of you will know this is just absolutely fundamental before you start thinking and designing, to understand what we've got to work with. We actually, in the end, developed our design not using some of the bamboo or so much of the timber, but very much the key, as you'll see as we go on, is that local brick module there with its 4 holes. That became a key part of our design. This just gives an org chart of the team then, and a little bit more structure. So with our design team that are all here today at the bottom, and then how we interacted with Building Trust on the ground as our interface, really directly in being able to speak in the local language to the school, the headmaster, and then the wider community and other school leaders that were all part of that key stakeholder process. The timeline of our project, it took Marty about sort of 10 months to formulate the sort of right project for us, and for us to then make the decision that we were going to go for it. And then over a period of sort of 6, 7 or 8 months in 2016, we then developed the design through around 2 key consultation events, and then very much focusing on a build period of just over 3 months. Before the monsoon season would kick in that May. So it was fundamental that we could sort of hit that build program, otherwise we really were going to be pushing on another school year or another half a year before we could start. So we ran the process from WW by, once we'd established that brief and those key parameters, by opening it up to our whole studio, by giving them a briefing, and then we gave them about a couple of weeks to come up with their own ideas. And then we held a series of charrettes where they presented those back, and then a core group who were leading the project would then go through the quite difficult process of piecing together what we felt were some of those best ideas. But it was really fantastic. A lot of those then fed into the final design. So these are just a couple of slides. I won't go into too much detail, but some of the responses that we got. So some people took a very sort of environmental approach. Others looked very much at sort of the detail and form, and it was great to get that variety. This one was more about understanding phasing with the existing buildings, either to plug on or to build independently, or to think in the future how future expansion of the school could work in and around the courtyard itself. A different level of drawing that you get back is always interesting. This is quite precise and detailed, and really looked at how those spaces could work. This was just one of our colleagues, and looking at different outside spaces that are really important in and around those buildings. So not just the buildings itself, but the where the children can play and learn, you know, adjacent to the designs. Others that are much simpler, really just, you know, labouring on, and quite rightly, the importance of those fundamental sort of principles of exploiting the passive ventilation, building on the plinth to avoid the monsoon flooding, etc. And then we developed that to close in a more of a developed concept, of which this was an early sketch. And then we arrived at a very simple plinth building that really, the grey in the diagram at the top there indicates the 3 classrooms I've talked about. The green is the library. And then what we did, which has been I think one of the major successes, is just then pulling those apart to create this covered outside space, which is so important in the inclement weather, and provides a further view through to the landscape. And this Building Trust then went out and took some of those early ideas. So that is very, very quick, but it just shows you a bit of that early stage consultation that they did, and then brought back some of those findings back into London, where again David here from Building Trust was over at certain points, and then working through bringing some of those materials, the brick, onto the table, so that we could get a real feel for those early days. And then as we progressed, we just worked up the level of detail of those drawings through more developed sketches. understanding the sizes, the modules, the grid that we were going to use in a bit more detail. And again, through in terms of the section, and again, working with our team here to understand what size overhangs we need, how the structure was beginning to work, the spans, and how the passive ventilation was starting to play out. And then we produced a set of tender drawings that were through again with discussing with building trust the right level of detail that they would then take out to tender to chosen contractors. So this is really just to show you the level of detail that we went to in terms of information that formed a pack itself. So again, a high level drawing of our building placed within that compound. And then the general arrangement drawing, broadly working on a 3.5 metre grid across the site. And some of the key sections and elevations. We went for then a repeating on the doors and windows. We developed a very, very simple metal repeating solution whereby at night the building is closed off and secure, which was an important part of the brief. But then in the mornings the school could be opened up, those doors could be fully folded back to allow that the ventilation or the winds off the paddy fields to flow through the building and really animate it in the day. So this was the level of drawing we went to with some notes on that, and then these were actually then developed by a fabricator as part of the tender process. So it's a bit of a jump into John now to come up and talk about some of the structural design in a bit more detail and some of the things we had to wrestle with the site. So come on up, thanks.
We were quite delighted to be asked to help with this project, and it was something quite unlike anything we'd done before. We'd built plenty of schools, we worked internationally, but we'd never put the two together in quite this way. So when we were asked, we actually just paused for a moment and we actually went and asked our engineers, if we do this, are you going to support us with your time and ideas? And there was a resounding yes. So we sort of dived in. And as an engineer, I suppose a structural engineer, and thinking about this project, the first thing we like to do is we like to think about the design criteria. What is it that's defining how we're going to design this building? And we've already heard about the climate, which is the massive one. So we've got this very hot and wet climate. You've seen the impact on those existing buildings, the timber rotting away and things. We've seen the raised podium. We need to include all these things into our design. On top of that, we've got things like the local design codes. Well, they don't have any local design codes. Most of what's built in Cambodia at the moment is through international aid. And when people do that, they bring their own codes. And we did the same, unfortunately. We used Euro codes, which is, I don't know. This is one of the first, I say it's one of the first things, it took quite a while to get it. First things we asked for, and in January 27 we received this little report, which for us was very important. It's a very simple site investigation. It tells us what the quality of the ground is like, where we can found this building, and just, to keep it all safe and strong. Oh no. Oh, I'm missing a slide, am I? Yes. Never mind. We've also seen previously that material list, and it is a very limited material list. If you added into that, if you delved into that, you would have seen, there was sand, there was big sand, there was cement, there was rebar. You've got reinforced concrete. There are masonry units, there were steel angles, there was everything you needed for a simple building. And we wanted to bring those materials together, and as Phil said, this is a building which had to be built by the community, with the community. It had to be very simple, but we hoped we were going to learn from the existing buildings and sort of maybe just do a step further and improve it maybe slightly. So what did we do? It's an incredibly simple building. It's a concrete frame building with concrete columns dotted at the corners of each room and halfway between. It's all raised up on a large podium deck to keep it up out of the flood zone. And slightly unusually maybe, we've got a bamboo reinforced concrete floor. I mean, bamboo reinforcement's not normal. Steel is better, but this is incredibly cheap. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to control the settlement of this over time. We're trying to control cracking. And yes, in 15 years, you probably are going to have to come back and put a bit more screed or concrete on top. But that's fine, it's going to do a good job and we can afford it now. Moving up the building, we've got a very simple thing again. It's a concrete ring beam which holds it all together. So we've concentrated our structure just into that frame. And in doing that, we've left all these spaces and gaps, and that's going to allow the architecture, your ventilation, your light, and everything to play as it wants. The traditional buildings around the site, they're normally masonry. They're quite heavy, which is great from a thermal mass perspective, but from a ventilation and light perspective, they weren't. I don't think they were fantastic. I don't know, Phil. I didn't go. So moving up, we had these trusses, and they look slightly strange, and that's because the shape of these trusses was developed very closely with Integration and Weston Williams to really look at the orientation of the building and the climate and how best we could build with these materials to provide, not a warm climate, but a cool climate inside. And through live modelling within workshops here, we actually found this little top vent solution was the most effective way of doing that. And so we end up with a rather strange little truss. And it's a strange little truss of the very same, back-to-back angles that we had on that list of 12 items. So everything here is as simple as it could be. And if you had a hacksaw and a drill, you could build this quite simply, we hoped. To that, we added some really simple details. We need to hold these down into position. So we developed very simple details, which were modelled in 3D, again, just making it as simple and as clear as possible to be built locally. And then we packaged all this information up, as Phil said, for tender. So everything got translated locally. So we hope this says what we think it says. It says 200 by 200 there, that's right. We don't really know. We didn't go through the exercise. But that went out to the contractors. So there was going to be a local contractor who was going to partner with the Building Trust and the local people to try and deliver this. And all contractors everywhere, the world over, have better ideas, apparently. So very rapidly they came back and told us that what we thought were quite nice little back-to-back angle trusses should be a truss made like this. And despite the fact this has a lot more material in it, and we thought a lot more effort because you've got to weld this all together, this was cheaper. So who were we to say any otherwise? So we sort of rechecked this, and of course it was absolutely fine. In fact, it works better for the cantilevers. So great, off they go. And we're going to hear a little bit about it on site in a moment. But when it did get to site, they decided, there those trusses went in, and they had a better idea on site again, and now those tie trusses became, propped in the middle with another big truss, which sort of is a bit strange, but we back-checked it, it's fine. But yeah, it's kind of relieving to know that contractors the world over are basically the same. I think, Eugene, you're going to tell us a bit more about site. Cheers.
Hello everyone, I'm Eugene Healy. I'm one of the architects here at Weston Williamson. I was very lucky in that I was not only involved in the design, but I was one of the team that went out to the site to help with the build and witness the building go up. So I'm going to talk about that experience, and it certainly was an experience. But also, before we could start that, we obviously needed to find a contractor. So once the structural design was complete, Building Trust issued a tender package to 4 local contractors, and this was the winning submission by a local contractor called Ross Sothi, who turned out to be a remarkably patient man, a very friendly guy, made us feel really welcome. But I think this process really illustrates the value of having people like Building Trust on the ground who understand the local market and who can interpret a bill of quantities in Khmer, and who also know to approach local contractors who employ local people and are embedded in the community, so they're encouraged to do a good job because their reputation really relies on it. And this was the local workforce, not a collection of professional contractors, more a band of local community farmers who tend to go wherever the work goes. So they would come to site depending on what particular skill was needed on the day. So quite rare to have everyone on site at once like this. Quite often a team of 4 or 5 people just working through the labour with us on the site. And they were supported by a team from Weston Williamson. So our approach was very much to send people out in pairs throughout the build at particular work stages. So first Tom and Michelle at Earthworks, Maddie and Darryl when the RC frame was going up, myself and Patrick when the brickwork walls were being erected, and then finally Rowan, Ivana and Phil when the roof trusses were going up and the finishes were going on the building. And that gave us a real flavour of the entire construction process. And then afterwards, Maddie and Chris visited the site to see what it was like in use after it was completed. One of the things we wanted to do was to be very close to the building site. Perhaps not as close as this, so we were offered accommodation in the headmaster's office, which was probably a little bit too close for comfort. But what it offered in terms of convenience for the site, it also offered in terms of inconvenience, in terms of sleeping arrangements. So we mustered together some desks to form ad hoc beds and tied mosquito nets from the roof. And probably my biggest single memory of this is that we didn't just have ourselves for company in there at night. You're obviously in the middle of a very rural setting. And although I never saw it, there was a very, very loud gecko which snarled violently all the way through the night. I never saw it, but in my imagination it was 6 foot long. So I often greeted the dawn with great relief. And I think being on site kind of gave us the exposure not just to the construction process, but also to school life. So we're really embedded in the school. So at one end of the site in the morning, as Phil mentioned, the kids would gather for assembly. And at the other end, the construction team would gather to talk about the work to be done during the day using models and visualizations and the drawings. And indeed, the model was something which we did quite early in the design process. And that was really a useful tool, not just at construction, but during the kind of the collaboration and trying to communicate with the local community just what the building would be like. It really communicated so much more than just a series of 2D drawings. And that's very early stages on site. You can see the materials just beginning to arrive. And when the work did start, it was remarkable the extent to which it's all done by hand, a lot of manual labour in very, very hot conditions. As Phil mentioned, there was a race against time to do it before May arrived, and with it the startlingly hot conditions and the rainfall. But even in February, it was very, very hot during the middle of the day. The other remarkable thing for me was the extent to which everything was constructed from raw materials on site. So I guess in the UK, we're used to a move towards off-site construction, things coming as prefabricated. But very much here, things turn up in their raw state, and then the team spend a long time constructing things from scratch. So for example, the clips for the rebar arrive just as spools of wire. They get cut into lengths, then they get straightened, and then they get formed into clips using very basic materials and tools. That gave me a real sense of how buildings are built up from the very, very bones, really. And again, as the RC frame went up, at this point we're just about to strike the formwork for the ring beam, and you can see the use of any material really available in terms of what's around the site to prop up and act as scaffold for the ring beam, all the while working around the kids in the school who, because they're on rotation, quite often there's kids out doing PE while we're working on the site at the same time. So it's quite a unique environment. What was also interesting was how the contractors use innovation in very kind of simple, clever ways in the absence of tools that we would take for granted here. For example, again with the RC frame going up, they used a hollow transparent tube as a homemade spirit level. So you fill it with water, and that gives you 2 levels very far away that you can then use to mark up levels on the RC frame. And then following that, just stringing a framework of wire across to course the brickwork. So all very basic but very clever methodologies that they used on site to do the work. And again, because we're in the middle of a very agricultural setting, quite often that came into the site. One of the contractors had a pet hen that he brought in every day and kept in this homemade wire enclosure, where he carefully cleared away all the rubble to give it a nice bedding, and took it out now and again to pass it around and pet it. Also, impromptu invasions of cattle from the local fields, which became quite an issue when we were laying the floors. Quite often there was quite a bit of rework to be done once your lovely screed had been floated and a cow walks through the middle of it. And really, for me, the heart of the project is the brick that we used for the walls, and we really wanted to make that a feature of the building. It's a very local material, but it's also got this beautiful quality in terms of the proportion, which is quite different to what we're used to here in the UK. Also, because it's extruded and cut, the perp ends have got these really lovely 4 openings on the end face. We really wanted to make a feature of that in the design. Here in the library wall, playing with the transparency of that when you lay it stack bonded face on, so you get kind of a transparency in the wall. Also exploiting its ability to ventilate the classrooms when you lay it like that. The challenge really came in trying to communicate those slightly unusual bonding arrangements to the local contractors. I think with absolutely with very little Khmer, certainly Khmer that didn't extend to stack bonded feature wall. Trying to communicate something like this was really done through stacking things up on site, demonstrating it, too much bemusement. But I think then that turns to pride when you do something that's really, I think, quite elegant, like this particular wall. Bricks were also unexpectedly useful communication tools. Quite often we draw in the sand, but also use bricks to draw on with a marker to communicate ideas. And as the roof trusses began to take shape and the building began to take shape, sometimes you saw things that perhaps you would prefer not to in terms of on-site practices. And although you try to design these kind of risks out by a single-story building with a lightweight roof, etc., you can't really plan for local practices or human behaviour on the day. In particularly, the use of a welder at high level while balanced on a plank is quite terrifying. So I think when you think about lessons learned from this project, I think how you design out those kind of risks is an interesting thing, and it might be interesting to hear Article 25's attitude to trying to design out and mitigate those kind of risks. A big day on site was when the doors came, probably one of the few things that were actually fabricated off site, fabricated in a workshop in Phnom Penh. And they were, you do appreciate some of the design decisions that you made when you're on site. The good thing about these were they span from the slab right up to the ring beam, so there's no lintels, none of that work in terms of trying to level and get the doors to fit. They just fitted very simply to the RC frame. And they also needed to be painted, which was a key decision. I think one that we deliberately left until we were out on site, because we really wanted to try and understand the local vernacular and the colours around the site. I know Phil took that big responsibility. I don't know if you want to talk about your experience of doing that.
A couple of words on that. So, you can see from probably this early days render that we did that we went a little bit sort of perhaps architectural kind of colours, but we knew, we were dealing with a school, and particularly then when we had the feedback from what was in the village, some of those early houses and the use of colour. And we were also conscious that it probably might be a limited palette when we got out there. So I went with the foreman on the back of his bike to the next village where, we had the choice of about 10 paint colours. And I was really keen in that door design we'd come up with. They were all ventilated on the bottom and top panels, but we'd purposely created a solid panel in the middle of the door so that the idea was either a chalkboard or something on the inside. But actually what played out really well is then using primary sort of paint colours within that group of 10 that I could choose from. and then rather than writing a number or something, actually using the colour to code the different classrooms. And then in the mornings when the building was opened up, that was probably the easier bit. The really tough bit was the green. And I ummed and ahed for a day or two, talked to the team we had out there, and then decided on experiencing those rice fields and the really fledgling little rice shoots that was the landscape beyond, decided to go for that sort of lime green colour. And we ordered the paint, and then I went through it with the headmaster here. Wasn't quite sure what he felt, but got some thumbs up from Building Trust saying he was happy. But then the next morning, when it was at the sunrise and before anyone had come to site, we got out of those mosquito nets, and I did look at it, and I did have a moment, what have I done? And I was conscious of maybe the team back here breathing down my neck, saying, what have you done with that colour? But after that moment, I really believe we did make the right choice, and I think hopefully as you see the finished building now that I do feel that the choice was the right one in the end. But that was one of those moments where, yeah, pressure decision.
I think you can really see though the success of that colour when you see it in the context of the rice paddies. So as the grass began to grow, that colour began to make more sense in terms of the context, in terms of framing those views, etc. And I think one of the other kind of decisions that you do fret over when you're out there is, will the end users, will the kids and the teachers take to those kind of spaces that you had imagined they would? And one of the key elements of the design was this elliptical play space, but also informal teaching space that was quite key to us. And when you're on site, you realise that actually the kids really use the existing verandas a lot, because in the middle of the day, when they're on their break, it's a sheltered, shaded space to play in, and they seemed to take very naturally, once the building was nearly complete, they kind of intuitively began to occupy this play space, which really kind of gave us the reassurance that it was the right design approach. And I've just got a few pictures of the building in its complete state or near complete state, and you can see in terms of what Phil was speaking about, that when the building is open, you get those colours that demark each classroom along the length in a kind of relatively subtle way, and the doors just fold right back onto the walls to give a free shaded access route along the face of the building. And then in the building itself, in the classrooms, we wanted them to be as light as airy and well ventilated as possible, but also to be as economical as possible in terms of the finishes. So we have just a datum across the top of the door lines to which we bring up the plaster, and then beyond that we just express the material of the building and the concrete frame, and also allow a certain level of air to pass through at high level through the classrooms. I think that was quite successful. And again, just in its context, providing a view through the play area into the courtyard, and then also out in the other direction, framing the view through the building was quite an important aspect of the design for us. And I think we've got some very short video, I think is the next slide. So I'll end there and say thank you very much for coming, and enjoy this short video of the building in use.
Solid performance, and it created different learning environments whereby teaching could be delivered in a different way, and a way that is more interactive with the children themselves.
Later, Hai chỗ trận trường kỳ.
Well, I think we all enjoyed that hugely. I'm Sunand Prasad, I'm chair of Article 25, and let's just start with, I think you've heard from some of these people, you don't need to introduce all of them, but Mahdi, would you say? I mean, everybody knows you, but say who you are anyway.
My name is Mahdi, I'm a project architect at Article 25 and used to be part of the team here at Weston Williamson.
Chris Williamson.
Yep, Chris Williamson. We celebrated our 30th anniversary a few years ago. We get involved in a lot of local projects and wanted to do something international. And Mahdi introduced the project to us, and it was really fantastic to do.
And these two gents you've already met. So we have, I think, about half an hour, is that right, to have a chat?
Yeah.
A bit more?
20-25 minutes maybe.
20-25 minutes, okay. Better be sharp. I'm sure you're all full of questions, so please raise your hand and we'll take questions in bunches. I'll just kick off, and actually I don't know quite who to address it to. Maybe to people who haven't yet talked, so that leaves two over there. What do you think that a bunch of people like us living in the West, shall we say, can bring to localities like this, which people there can't do themselves?
Interesting question, because when we started the project, as you could see from the explanation that Phil gave, everybody came up with not outlandish, but sophisticated proposals for the school. And as you can see from the finished result, it's nowhere near as sophisticated as we would have liked. It has to be, you have to deal with the local vernacular, and I think they don't need the sort of architecture that sometimes architects think they ought to have. They want, and the going to see it, I didn't have time to go and see it when it was being built, but on a visit to Australia, I went after it had been built for a year, and to see it in use, I think it's the spaces and the play spaces. I think if we contributed one thing, it was a different way of getting them to use a building and getting them to think about what a building is, and that central space allows them to teach in a different way. So, you know, if you can do one thing right on a project like this, that's worth taking away. But I think if we'd have done it again, we would have probably done it more conventionally. But it was a gradual. It was a huge compromise as it was.
Because I think it's quite sophisticated. I think actually its simplicity and sort of the exactness of it. It sort of registers with everything. The views, dealing with the climate. We'll talk about that a bit more. But I think actually a fancy, more let's say complex building may have been potentially less sophisticated. Anyway, to be discussed. Mahdi, do you want to?
I think one thing that we bring to the table is similar to Article 25. A lot of the places that we work in, they look to us in the West and they want a Western building. They want a concrete building. They want an AC-controlled environment. And what we're trying to do is go back to the vernacular and say, let's use local materials. Let's use the local skills that you have and use natural techniques, natural ventilation. And it's the same thing that we do in all our projects in Article 25. And I think that's one thing from our side. When they see Westerners, proposing these simple buildings, and the buildings that we propose, and it's not a design that you'd expect from a star architect, And I think they look at it that we're using the simple materials, maybe in a slightly different way. So, for example, the bricks is something that they always use, but they probably won't take as much care when they're building it, because they rendered the block, they rendered the bricks. So, when they were actually laying all the brick courses, I remember I was there with the rag, and I was cleaning each course as they were going along, and they probably didn't understand why I was doing it. But then after they saw that, when the mortar was dripping down, visually it looks very, it doesn't look as aesthetically pleasing. And then by the end of the day, all the bricklayers were kind of competing against each other and comparing their wall against someone else's, saying, "Oh, look at my wall." Yeah. And I think it's for us, and it's something that we still continue to do, is being on site and actually, just because they can do the job properly, but it's just sometimes they just need a bit of direction. And if you just oversee that, it does.
So you're saying two things there. One is quite a complex thing, which is that, in a sense, by being from the West, you're able to validate or return to a kind of local genius, if you like.
On a local level.
On a local level, in a way that otherwise, can be constantly asking for different kind of solutions. Right, great. Anybody ready for a question? So we'll have those two questions first. We'll go to the left side of the room. Can you say your name and then ask the question?
My name is Dominic. Hi. Thank you very much. This was incredibly fascinating. What really struck me in the final video was that the building process itself seemed to be just as important as the building after it was completed. So I'm curious about what you learned during that building process with the community itself, and what you would do differently next time.
Thank you. And you, sir?
Hi, my name is Boyan. I am one of the integration directors. I was involved on the project from the beginning. One question, and it's a bit about a secret that you haven't actually said anything about, which is that the project was a bit larger at the beginning. Yeah. We know that when we got involved, and obviously because of the famous QS problems, we had to shrink a bit. Any plans after all of this to go back and do what the original design was?
I'll leave that to Weston Williamson to answer.
Okay, so there's two questions.
To answer the second one first, when I did go back, I went back with the intention of that we would do the courtyard building. That was going to be our next project. But when I got there, they'd already started it. They accepted money from the Chinese government, and the Chinese make it a stipulation that once you accept their money, because of trade agreements and political influence, you're not allowed to accept anybody else's money. So they basically don't want us to be involved anymore. But the great thing about it is that if we hadn't have done this, it kind of, I think the story was that it shamed them to do something else. So that and so us, by giving our money to build the school, the local government has put more money, and the Chinese have given more money to do it. So there is some, it's a catalyst, really.
There was a lot of plans, and the plans never came to reality. And then we kind of went there, built something, and then the local government was probably like, "Oh, wow, yeah." And I think that kind of, as Chris said, it acted as a catalyst. And I think it's great for the school because they've got another school building. It's a shame that we couldn't be part of that, because I think the original idea of having the courtyard and this kind of L-shaped building would have been really interesting, because even through this project, when we were designing it, we were looking at different phasing options. So one of the things we probably didn't discuss as well is the central area where the sunken seating area is. The school initially was so against it. They were like, "What is this space? We don't need it. We just need a classroom." So we kind of fought hard to say, no, it's an external classroom that you can still use. However, we will try and make it that if, for example, once the building is complete and you're not happy with it, you can turn it into a classroom. So you can see how the modular of the structure, where the central area can be infilled, and the returns of those walls, there's already 2 windows and 2 doors. So they basically get flipped to the front and to the back, and all they need to do is infill the sunken area and put the walls up. So we said, that was some of the phasing that we looked at is, if you're not happy, because end of the day, it's not about us, for us to be happy. They need to be happy with their building and for them to, for it to meet their needs. So we said, okay, we're proposing this, but we've given you all the elements that you can expand. If you don't like this, you can infill it. So I think that was quite...
And what about the issue about the process?
Yeah, I'll take that one. I think what was fascinating for me, having, done the process and then essentially taken that process and been part of putting it into action, was what I personally hadn't envisaged at all, was the amount of involvement that actually the community, not just the school, did have in the process on the site and when we were there. So, I think once we learnt very quickly that generally 95% of the contractor team were the farmers that lived in houses actually just around the village. So it wasn't Mr. Rothy or whatever his name is that pulled his builders from Phnom Penh or anything. So in terms of what we do differently, that was a lovely thing that I felt the village sort of embraced it, and the fact that we weren't just in there for 1 or 2 weeks, that we were there over a period of time from the start to the finish, was really valuable. And when they were off duty, not building in the evening, their families and their children would come and interact with us on the site as well. So it wasn't just through those school hours. Actually, this compound is a central space within that village, because there isn't another compound or town square anywhere else, so it does act as that centre. So all those added layers that I think partly through our design and piecing the building round, all came together. Some of them by chance, which always does happen with projects. You can't, premeditate everything. So, so in terms of doing things differently, I think if we did another one there, that same process would happen, and it was incredibly rewarding, I think, on both sides.
Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would bring a camp bed to sleep in. I think would probably be the initial response. But I think we did a lot of things right. I think being on site was fantastic. Being involved with the school on site and seeing how the kids use the spaces, how they respond to the environment in terms of using all the shade, etc. I think it's not so much that I do anything different, but I bring all that learning, I think, back into the next time we design a building in a similar climate. To witness it firsthand, I think, is incredibly instructive. Yeah.
I didn't go to site, so.
Can I ask you a question, integrity person? Sorry. Integration. Integration, yeah. With integrity, I'm sure. Yeah. So this is, it's a very particular climate to design to, hot, humid, tropical monsoons and so on. Did you model all that beforehand, or were you able to?
This is a dream building for any engineer, because if somebody comes here and say, we're going to do the building and there's no electricity, the first thing that you think, so apart from drainage, what are you going to do? But the fact is that if you go to the basics, which means for the history, people built different buildings with no electricity, no air conditioning, no materials that we have today. And they delivered beautiful pieces of architecture. And the buildings that, when you look at M&E, works perfectly. We have spaces around the world which are cool during the most difficult climate that you have. So there's no differences doing something here. It's just that you use, as you say, a modern technology. So what we did is we initially thought it's going to be easy, and we're going to do the model, obviously, of the building. And initially it was basically two different buildings, and we modeled both of them and tried to actually play with everything that is there already on the site, which was this massive tree there, offering some shading, and looked at the daylight and also the ventilation, natural ventilation aspects. And it, as always, it became, as a design developed in a way where the roof was changed, as Mahdi is aware, and things developed slowly but surely architecturally. We did model at the end, I think, 10 or 15 different options, basically, and looked at all of them. And we came up with something that we thought was basically the best advice that we can give to Mahdi to implement on site. And for us, I think that the major piece of problem was the use of the brick, actually, that Mahdi then came at some point and said, well, you know, you're talking about the daylight, but we're going to use this hollow brick, so can you tell us how is this going to affect the internal space? And to model that, you don't want to go there. It's very complicated.
Did you model that in CFD? Or?
No, well, it's a part of it. We use Design Builder, actually, to model the building. And we looked at the basics of the natural ventilation and the daylight, and it was difficult to actually look at the effect that the brick or the portion of the light that would come through the brick would have on the building. But then we also look at the ventilation aspect, and with Mahdi we agreed that on a certain sides you want to have that hollow brick, but on a certain sides you also don't want to create the whole thing where too many spaces are open in a way. So I think at the end they implemented that on site. But it was an interesting experience.
Interesting.
Any more? Next round. Yes, please.
I just have a question. I'm just a bit curious about the initial process of finding this project to work on. So it was, I think, Building Trust. Did you say it was the client? So was there? I mean, how did Weston Williamson propose the design? Did they look at other local architects? What kind of drove them to look at? Yeah, I'm just curious as to that process.
I think it's surprisingly difficult to find a project that, you know, most charities just want money, which is fair enough, and then they can do their own project. But for us as architects, I think we wanted to find a project that we could get involved in and be involved in and have a contribution with our skills as well as our money. And so we looked, it took us about 2 or 3 years to find the right project, because we wanted it to be inclusive, so it would be open to boys and girls and non-discriminatory, and it's finding the right project in the right country and trying to I hope, one of our criteria was that it had to be in a democracy, but that's often in emerging economies is not always possible. And this seemed to be a really great project, and I think the video shows that that they enjoy the process of the building as much as having the building themselves, and the fact that people went out there and helped build it was a great contribution. So for us, it ticked all the boxes, but it is quite difficult to find those projects, really. Much more difficult than you would imagine.
Any more? Next round of questions. Shall I ask you a question, the audience, that is? B, would you like to say something about how we work at Article 25? And, it's such a similar process, but it'd be nice to just get some reflections on comparisons.
I did not work on this project, but it's beautiful, and I love the colours most of all.
Yes.
And I think it was much helped by the fact that there was probably only one yellow and one green in the shop. So we didn't have to make an architectural choice, and it came out really nice. It looks like children's toys, doesn't it? Okay, so at Article 25, we work very much like you did. And which is probably why Matti's working with us now, because it is not that dissimilar. It's the same goals. It's coming up with something that works for the local community and that you can build with the local community. And I don't know if it was happenstance that the local contractor actually consisted of a group of people from the village, but it was very fortunate because we, Article 25, very much try to encourage that and actually bring people from the local community to work on the project, and whilst they're working on it, gain some new skills, which we don't have the luxury of putting a big team out on a project, but we put out the site architect. And if you look at our website, we once or twice a year we advertise for these positions. They're open to anyone who's a skilled architect with some site experience, and all we ask is 6 months or a bit more, and expenses are taken care of one way or another, and that person guides that process along. But a lot of the people working on it have no construction skills, and maybe as far as they got before was carrying bricks or wheeling wheelbarrows or digging, and when they come away from the project they may be a plasterer of some experience, or bricklayer, or electrician, at least a starting electrician. And people really appreciate the opportunity to gain a new skill and expand their livelihood. And I think that happened here without anybody trying. It looks like it anyway, or at least the bricklayers learned how to do nice clean brickwork and probably how to point. And it's lovely. It's lovely to see it happen with other people and in other countries.
Great. Any more? Thank you. Say who you are and then.
Hi, I'm Josh from Corporate Studio. Chris, you said you went back to the project at a later date to find that the Chinese government had given some money towards, was it in process or it was finished, the next phase of it?
More or less finished, yeah. They'd just got on and done it.
And were any of the kind of design techniques like the brick or the courtyard space, were any of that employed in the new phase?
They used similar windows, so I think but it was more, they'd used, like we did, we built on what was there before, because what's there before works. So the form is similar, and but they'd use some of the vernacular and some of ideas from the new building, but hadn't copied either, really.
You know, those windows are very interesting, apart from the colour, which is also very interesting, by the way. I'm not saying the colour's not interesting. The colour's lovely. But in a way, I was thinking, so Weston Williamson has a very strong architectural and with a view to engineering pedigree, you know, architecture which enjoys the connection and the sophistication of those things. And the windows, I think they're very Weston Williamson windows. They certainly aren't P&P windows. So, do you know what I mean? So the windows and the louvers and so on, actually, I know it's a bit corny, but actually they reminded me of train windows, you know, from my childhood in India, and those little sort of shutters that you have with louver ventilators. Of course, you know that it's very old hat in a way, but you do it. You know, you because you design, presumably you drew them and they got fabricated exactly as you drew them in Phnom Penh. Is that right? Give or take, yeah. So I think it's quite an interesting kind of imprimatur.
Well, in our old office on Tanner Street, we had exactly the same windows, but they were in grey. Yeah. And the idea, so what we used to do there is, because they were louvered windows, you can open the back insulated panel and have the building ventilated at night, so people can't break in, but it's like opening a window, but you've got a louver there. So
you don't need insulated panels. So.
Yeah, so it's, you know, so there is, I guess, there is a consciousness about it, but and also you have to deal with, you know, who can make these things, and by talking to the local contractors, that you know they could do that. So it seemed sensible, and do them in metal rather than in timber, which lasts longer, and paint them green.
So the fundamental idea of, in a hot tropical climate, to maximise airflow through the building in the right weather, plus have big overhanging eaves to deal with monsoon and all that, that's kind of a given. But with modern materials like this, you get fantastic uplift on all those. And how did you? Do you want to say something about? Yeah, about all that kind of nerdish stuff, you know, which we all love.
I'll keep it short. I mean, for me, I suppose it's almost think about those three buildings together, which are on site. You had the original building, which was masonry walls with a timber truss roof and tiles. And those big masonry walls, they're working really well from your thermal mass point of view, and they breathe as well. They're letting some of that hot air out the top. And you can see the evolution to the next building, which was, they introduced concrete to get rid of the timber because the timber was rotting. And they put a steel roof on it, which then stopped the rain getting in and things like that. But actually in doing that, they created this sealed sort of layer on the top, and it was baking in the heat. So I hope the third building, again, goes that step further and sort of addresses some of those issues. I mean, from an engineering point of view, it's a very simple building. We do look at, the wind direction, we do look at the uplift, and we try and make those, decisions and those, we try to make this building as simple as possible. And I think it is as simple as possible, and as a result, the details to hold things down when you model it and things are very simple. It's just a few bolts. So yeah, I'm not going to go into the nerdy detail of, fluid dynamics and things like that. But it's a simple building with a really simple pitch roof, and hopefully, especially with the work from integration, it works. I hope.
So was it always going to be reinforced concrete for the columns and the ring beam?
No, the materials sort of came out of what we wanted to achieve. We had very limited materials to work from. You saw the list with 12 items on it. So you could make masonry walls, you could have a concrete frame. We looked at bamboo, extensively at bamboo, which is something we love. And as Maddie said, as sort of Westerners looking at it, maybe we were quite tied to that as material, from a sustainability perspective initially. But we were guided very clearly that locally, maybe it wasn't what was expected or wanted. And I think as Weston Williams sort of guided the design through with the ideas and and with the services ideas and the ventilation, the sort of design came together. And
so in terms of cost, does it compare well with what, let's say, what the Chinese have built or somebody else built before that?
Well, yeah, we were given a budget. We funded the building, so it cost exactly what we said it was going to cost, or what the budget was, and
that's a relief.
I mean, it's basically using exactly
I'm
the same,
with
exactly the same
others.
materials as the building next door.
Yeah.
But in a different way. So, and because, I mean, I think in the UK or in a more developed economy, a contractor looks at a set of drawings, and if he sees something unusual in it, he will think, oh, they want something different, so I'll add on a premium for that. But here, they just looked at the building and said, well, it's brick and it's steel and it's concrete. I know how to do that. And they didn't add on that premium for working in the materials in a different way. And it took the same time. So, you know, the cost is usually a function of the materials and the time it takes. And they were able to do it on time, and it was fine.
And Building Trust played a very kind of integral part of that, where they basically were acting as the architect or the client. So they were the main person who was liaising with the tenderers. And one of the things that they, to reduce costs, they ended up buying all the materials. So the contractor was just there for the labour. So there was a lot of ways that we wanted to reduce the cost, and then the team in Cambodia, they said, we'll purchase all the materials. Whenever anything's running out, you give us a call and we'll deliver it to site. So that reduces the, you know, the overheads that a contractor might add.
And one of the risk as well.
And the risk.
The risk of not being able to find something or not available this week. They didn't have to think about that. They just had to supply people to site.
Yeah. Great. I have a question there.
Yeah, I sort of had a two-part kind of question, I guess. One is, looking at that photo there, it looks like there's the bricks being used in the podium itself. Is the podium a mix of reinforced concrete and brick? And then the other thing is, going off all the photos of the houses in the local area, they were raised quite high, and you said that was for flooding. Obviously those houses are much higher than this. Is that just because they want to create a full story? And how does flooding kind of sit within this site?
So I'll come back on that latter point. I think it's a dual purpose. Clearly, the flood waters only come up one or two sort of steps generally. So provided you're up at a podium level like the building, you know, you're going to be out of that. So in terms of the local houses, there's obviously a dual function that actually they're using it as essentially unfinished space to work, to shade, to sleep, and all their their paraphernalia that they haven't got in their living quarters above, which is, I guess, why, yes, it is a story or slightly higher.
Actually, those houses on stilts are very common in parts of the world, even where the climate isn't like that or there isn't flooding, because the animals, in fact, there are some cold regions I've been in where in the winter, the animals being underneath heats the house. So you get an enclosure with the animals crowded in underneath, and their warmth actually makes a big difference to the houses. So this is the genius, really, of kind of vernacular architecture, which is that several imaginations have gone to make it. And part of this is the rediscovery and revalidation of it with modern methods, so that some of the other customs, which weren't very effective and yet carried on regardless, can be filtered out. But on those traditional houses, they were on timber columns, aren't they? And are the timber columns on stone bases or something? Are they?
Usually on a stone base.
Yeah.
So they're not in the water continually, or not on the damp continually.
So how do they used to deal with the rot if they no longer want timber used?
Well, they were just big sections,
chunky,
timber sections. But it is interesting because Charles Correa talks about how, you know, we like all things Eastern, and they like all things Western, you know, that when we try and say we love this, they say why? We want what you've got.
That's partly an idea about progress, isn't it? And all those things. But is the timber getting very expensive as well? In India, for example, it's cheaper in many areas to build in stone than timber.
I think because of illegal logging, that's why that was one of the decisions that we made with Building Trust. You know, timber, should we include it? And because there's a lot of illegal logging going on, and also steel, you know, it's not widely available. So we had to make a judgment call, which one should we choose? And there was the robustness of the material for the doors that we thought would be better than timber doors, as well as to reduce the amount of illegal logging that's going on.
Just the second point on the plinth, correct me if I'm wrong, John, but I think, did we use the brick just to basically create the dwarf wall around the edge, and then we rendered it, and then we backfilled and pounded and rammed it down?
It's as simple as it could be, so everything that came out of the foundations is still in that plinth. And you can see, looking at the site, it's so flat, there weren't any sort of convenient mounds to go and steal. Everything had to be brought in and used as best we could. So yeah, it is just a little dwarf wall with a bit of render on it, really.
Any last questions? Okay, in which case, fantastic work. Huge thanks to Weston Williamson, and really it's a very beautiful building. I think everybody has appreciated it, and let's give a big applause to our panel in the traditional way.